The first scream doesn't sound human. It knifes through the stone corridors of the Hotel Saint-Paul, rattling the candle flames, making even the guardsmen forget their weapons for a breath. At first you think it's an animal, some wounded thing dragged into the palace kitchens and left to die. But then a second cry tears loose, raw and wordless, and every servant freezes because they know that voice. It's the King of France, it's Charles, and they know what that means. The storm has come again. You push through a knot of courtiers toward the royal apartments, and the smell hits you: sweat, old wine, damp wool, the sour trace of fear that clings to anyone who works too close to the crown. In the doorway, a boy in a liveried cap is kneeling, hands clasped, whispering a prayer he barely remembers, while inside the chamber, 4 men try to keep their ruler from tearing the skin off his own arms. The king's eyes are open, but not seeing. He's 20-something still in your mind, beautiful in that perilous way princes are when the artists love them more than God. Except the eyes now are wild and bottomless, as if some other person is looking out from behind his face. "Don't let her touch me," he whispers, hoarse, the words snagging like thorns. "She's a stranger. Send her away." His queen stands 3 paces off, white as the wax statue of a saint, too well trained to flinch in front of the chamberlain who will repeat every breath she takes to the factions waiting like wolves in the outer halls. The stranger he means is his wife. He has forgotten her name again. He has forgotten his own. A monk enters with a reliquary held high, a physician follows with a bowl of leeches, someone else clatters a set of iron stays, special rods sewn into padded garments to protect the king's arms and thighs because he believes he's made of glass. Charles won't sit in chairs if the wood creaks. He won't let anyone touch him if their hands are warm, as if heat alone might cause him to crack and spill into glittering shards on the floor. When the madness loosens its grip, he will consent to rule. When it tightens, he is a hunted boy trapped in a man's body, sprinting through the passageways and out the garden gates, howling, ducking behind buttresses, while soldiers fan across the courtyards like hunters in a forest. France has a king who sometimes cannot remember he is a king. And everywhere beyond these walls, people who have no bread, who have buried 2 children to the pestilence and the 3rd to hunger, are supposed to believe God chose him to lead them. But it wasn't always like this. To understand how a crown could become a hand-stitched cage, you have to walk back along the blood-shiny cobbles to the day the mask first slipped. It is August 1392, and the sun is mean and high. France lives in a constant state of almost war, raids on the frontiers, arrows sweet with English smoke, and the kind of court whispers that can drown a city faster than any flood. An assassination attempt on the king's councillor, Olivier de Clisson, at the Porte de Saint-Honoré has lit the powder. Charles is 24, reckless with youth and righteousness, and he decides to ride at once to Brittany to punish the culprit. He strips the road of ceremony and sweeps a lean column of men through the countryside, armored like a promise. You can picture it. The steel sighing against leather, horses pawing at hard earth, heat stroking the back of the neck until every thought is sticky and slow. Halfway through a forest near Le Mans, a ragged man darts out from the trees, his hair like a nest, his feet bare and blood long dried on them, and he grabs the king's stirrup. In a voice broken by fasting, he shouts that the king must not proceed, that disaster waits up ahead, that he has been sent by God to warn him. The guards strike him off, and he vanishes into branches, a scarecrow swallowed by leaves. The line reforms. A squire nods off in the saddle. The lance in his grip strikes another's shield. The clang is too sudden in the heat, and the king flinches as if someone has run a blade point first down his spine. His face changes. It goes very still. Then he spurs his horse forward and attacks. What follows does not sound like chivalry, it sounds like slaughter. Charles cuts down a banner-bearer who's marched beside him since his first campaign, then wheels and hacks another knight from the saddle. He is shrieking, not words but a sound that belongs in a stable at night, when a mare gives birth to a foal that cannot live. Men scatter, throwing themselves behind trees, not knowing whether to protect the king or protect the rest of the world from him. When they finally pull him from the horse, he's panting in the dirt, armor clawing at him like a second skin he can't peel off. His eyes look wrong, like he's crossed a river and left himself on the other shore, They wait for the fury to pass. It doesn't. Days become weeks, and the king is someone else, vacant, tormented, unreachable. He asks where the king has gone. He forgets the Dauphin's face. He calls for his sister, dead these 5 years. He refuses to be touched, then hurls himself at the guards for not embracing him. Physicians are summoned in a roster of desperate fashion, university men with Aristotle in their blood, and backyard men with superstition in their hands. They bleed him. They bathe him in rosewater. They chant until their voices crack. The court prays, harder now than ever, when a boy's body lies on a board in a side chapel, because there will be no priest to bury the poor if the crown goes numb forever. Gossip runs ahead like wildfire, sorcery, poison, retribution for the blood of the councillors, a demon in the king's skull. But the simplest truth feels like the cruelest. The heat broke him, or the pressure did, or a thread already fraying finally snapped. Madness, once it has entered a palace, does not politely leave. It takes rooms. It installs itself in the glass cases and the silk-lined chests, in the oil-smelled pages of decrees, in people who pretend they don't hear it scratching the doors. It does not come alone. It comes with opportunity. And nowhere in Christendom is opportunity sharper than in the city that lives by rumor and dagger, Paris. Watch what happens. When the episodes are quiet, Charles sits the council and loves to hunt, and for a week or a month, you almost forget the dead leaves in his gaze. Then the fever climbs again, and power flows downhill. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, steps forward, graceful and brilliant and stone-steady in public, while in private she rocks on her heels after the 5th sleepless night, listening to her husband breathe like a broken bell. The king's uncles, Burgundy and Berry, step forward, wide-shouldered with their own interests. The king's brother, Louis of Orléans, steps forward, velvet-mouthed and ambitious, beautiful with the kind of beauty that knifes people who look at it too long. Every step forward is also a step against someone else. The chamberlain counts the steps the way a gambler counts cards. The city listens and takes sides. Sometimes the king gets an idea that he is not allowed to be warm. He smashes the fires. He goes months without bathing, the stink of him a rumor that moves through the corridors like an extra courtier. Sometimes he becomes a child and hides in the cushions of the window seat and won't eat unless the food is cut into pieces no bigger than a saint's fingernail. Sometimes he is a creature stitched from fear, dodging behind pillars to avoid the queen whose hair smells of lavender, because he cannot let a stranger he does not recognize place a hand on his shoulder. And then sometimes, just often enough to keep a nation kneeling, he is exactly who he is supposed to be. He stands on a platform in the great hall, hands lifted, and sounds like a king who loves his people and hates their hunger. He signs relief for a town burned down to its well stones. He kisses a child with hair that looks like his sister's used to look and sends the boy's father to run the taxes in Chartres because some small luck should balance a life for once. The air shifts. Hope slips back in, brash and foolish and needed, but hope is a poor bodyguard. It can't stay awake every night. In January 1393, the court decides to chase despair from the palace with a party. The Queen's lady-in-waiting is to be married, and the new fashion is for masquerades, rompish and bawdy and dangerous. Charles seizes the idea like a lifeline. Let France see him laugh. Let the city gossip about feasting instead of funerals. 6 noblemen, including the king, have themselves sewn into costumes of flax and pitch and hair, dressed as wild men from the forests of nightmare, chained together at the waist for safety and shock. The musicians tune their instruments. The queen takes her seat. Candlelight slicks the walls, and somewhere out in the crush of masks and perfume and powdered faces, a door opens, a late guest pushes in with a torch held high, a careless, laughing cousin, Louis of Orléans. He swings the flame to get a better look at the capering monsters, and the room breathes all at once, because the wild men are not a game anymore. They are torches. The heat of hell bites skin and hair. A scream cleaves the music. One man is a pillar of fire running in a noose of chains. Another throws himself at the dais. A third claws at his own chest, ripping costume away, tearing skin with it because the pitch is fusing to flesh. The king, by a freak of luck if that's the kind of god you serve, has wandered far from the knot of dancers and found himself near the Duchess of Berry, who throws her heavy skirts over him and beats out the flames with a courage that will read like legend by morning. Around them, men die like candles blown the wrong way, bodies landing hard enough to jar the floor, the smell of burned hair and sweet-cooked meat grafted forever onto the walls of that room. They call it afterward the Bal des Ardents, the burning ball, and Paris does not forgive it. A mad king was one thing, a king who burned his friends alive to amuse himself was something else entirely, and no explanation, no apology, no proclamation about accidents and cousins with torches could change what people felt when they went to bed that night. The city turned in its sleep and sharpened its knives. It is not that the king is always cruel, it is that he cannot be relied upon to be anything at all. In a world built on vows, unpredictability is treason. The factions ossify. Burgundy gathers men who like order and meat and a heavy hand on the cities. Orléans gathers men who like poetry and some soft-handed libertinage as long as the taxes slide easier through velvet. The queen learns to be both ice and fire at once because any temperature stable enough to measure can be used against her. The king's episodes lengthen, then shorten, then lengthen again. No pattern except that there is no pattern. The plague still comes when it wants to. The English still raid where they can. The harvest still fails sometimes. In the midst of it, Paris does what Paris does best. It turns politics into theatre with live ammunition. You think you have seen riots. You have not seen Paris when the butchers come out of the Grande Boucherie and decide the law belongs to whoever can carry the bigger cleaver. That will come later, in the cabochon days, but the seeds are here. Resentment watered by rumor fed by the spectacle of a king who one week blesses the poor and the next week mistakes his servants for wolves. Everywhere you look, someone is making a list. Names of enemies, names of men who owe, names of men who are owed, names of men who must be removed like rotten teeth from the jaw of the city. And through it all, the king keeps breaking. There is a small story that ends up feeling like the largest. One morning, Charles refuses to move because he is convinced his bones are glass. The physicians feed him a little at a time and then devise garments stiff with whalebone and iron so he can stand without shattering. He becomes stately again, in a way, held upright by a contraption hidden under velvet, a puppet in a theatre none of his subjects know they are watching. He will kiss a reliquary with the careful grace of a man afraid the saint's skull will cut his lip. Then he will vanish for 8 days and be found by a kitchen boy in the orchard, clutching a tree and sobbing because a wind had moved the leaves in a way that sounded like soldiers. Every time he returns from one of these drowning spells, he leaves something behind. At first, you can't see what's missing. Later, you realize it's mercy in the eyes, or the part of him that used to laugh at a page who tripped and spilled wine over his own shoes, or the hand he used to put on the shoulder of a man he had to deny. The body remembers, but the face forgets how to show it. There is no mystery about what men do when a throne is warm and unguarded. They climb onto it. In November 1407, Louis of Orléans steps out of his hotel in the Rue Vieille du Temple, a handful of attendants around him, the night mild and damp, the lamps smearing light across puddles, and he doesn't make it to the end of the street. A dozen men in hoods surge from an alley with clubs and a hatchet. They smash his skull, break his arm, splinter the fingers of the hand that used to hold a pen in a way that made girls ache, and leave him in the road with the blood in him, going away like a tide. Paris wakes to the news that the king's brother has been murdered. And if there had been any doubt, the letter that arrives soon after brushes it away. John, Duke of Burgundy, admits to the deed and justifies it with a scholar's coolness. Tyranny prevented, council cleansed, France saved from a serpent. The pamphlets take it up. The sermons take it up. The Queen reads and does not faint, and then she does what she will continue to do. She survives. From here on, you can move through the years with your hand held out, touching the milestones as you pass them like cold stones in a chapel aisle. 1413, the Cabochon Revolt. Paris in a butcher's apron, reforms nailed to doors and then torn down again, heads on pikes, the smell of offal in the streets mixing with the incense of the cathedral because no one can agree on what worship looks like when the city splits in two. 1415, the English king, young and iron-willed, Henry V, lands in Normandy and chews through Harfleur, then turns toward Calais and meets a French host in muddy fields near a village called Agincourt. You stand on that field after, and you think the word harvest will never mean grain again. Banners lies in the muck like drowned birds. The cream of French chivalry is face down in a ditch. The king, back in Paris, stares at nothing for 3 days and then announces to a no-one who dares contradict him that he is St. George. The queen speaks to the ambassadors, while the walls of the palace hear things that will never be written down. After Agincourt, some truths stop pretending to be polite. France cannot agree on who France is. The Burgundians and the Armagnacs, names that start as surnames and end as identities, turn the kingdom into a chessboard with knives. The queen edges toward Burgundy because the Armagnacs refuse to acknowledge her authority as regent, and because a woman who has watched herself be named stranger by the man who shares her bed learns quickly that home is not a location, but a calculation. Somewhere behind all of this, you can still hear the king humming to himself sometimes, a child's song, not unhappy, and then falling silent with his head tilted as if he's listening for a sound only he can hear. There is an image the chroniclers like because it is simple and cruel. The king wanders the halls with a black hood pulled low, eyes wild, murmuring that he is not the king, not a king, never was a king, and the servants hide the mirrors because sometimes he becomes fascinated with his own reflection and speaks to it for so long that he forgets to drink. Then he wakes from it and the hood comes off, and a bowl of berries delights him, and he orders silk for a lady in waiting whose father lost his shop in a riot because the thought of silk will make her feel like the world is not ending. The man who signs the decree for her is the same man who, 2 days later, will insist with perfect sincerity that he is a shepherd's boy who took a wrong road and wandered into a dream. The closer you get to the end, the more the story stops being a story and starts being a time-lapse of erosion. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 is not a treaty so much as a confession, written in a city that has run out of choices. Henry V of England will marry Catherine of Valois, the king's daughter, and will be recognized as heir to the French throne, while the Dauphin, young Charles, the son who will later be Charles VII, is disinherited and labeled the spawn of treason and witchcraft. Some say the queen blinks but does not weep when the parchment is set before her husband and a hand is folded around his to guide the pen. Some say the king is lucid and agrees. The only people who know the truth of that moment are dead now, and their bones, if you dug them up and asked, would lie to you anyway, because that is what bones do when the living want simple answers. Paris receives the treaty like a blow, reels, steadies, and keeps breathing, because cities are better at surviving than kings. 2 years later, 1422, the axle of the world creaks half a turn. Within months, Henry V of England dies in France, and then Charles VI of France dies in Paris, a thin man in a fine bed who has spent half his reign walking through a fog no physician could disperse. The bells that toll for him have tolled for plague, for coronations, for the deaths of princes and of street sweepers, and the sound they make for him is not unique. A priest reads the prayers, a clerk notes it down. Someone opens a window to let the soul out, though whether it can find its way with Paris air so choked is a question no one wants to speak aloud. If this were a neat story, we would stop here. But Charles's reign refuses neatness. It spills backward and forward, staining everyone who touched it. After his death, people try to inventory what they remember like accountants, balancing a ledger for a business that burned down. They remember his tenderness with children. They remember the days he carved out of chaos and laid like little carpets in the lives of people who would never meet him. They remember the glass, the dirt under his nails, the way he'd drift in and out of a council, dropping a remark like a jewel into the middle of a dispute, and then be gone again into whatever darkness waited in the next room. They remember the bal des Ardents, and you can almost taste the smoke when people talk of it even years later. They remember the day he burst into a church service and howled so loudly the priest fled. And they remember the day he knelt for an hour at the feet of an old woman who had come to petition him about her field, not because she was powerful, but because he had suddenly recognized in her a face from his childhood that she did not actually wear. They remember the way he sometimes looked at the queen, some mix of fear and longing, and how she, trained to be glanced at, met that look and translated it into policy because her body was her first language and politics her second. They remember the murders, Orléans first, later John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, hacked down on a bridge at Montereau in 1419, under the gaze of the Dauphin's men, his blood on the planks like a signature no one could scrub out, and how each death promised stability and delivered only more knives. They remember the year the butchers ran the city, and the university wrote essays about proper bloodletting, and the saints watched from their niches with expressions carved to be merciful and ended up looking tired. They remember how often he apologized without using any words a person could write down. A hand pressed to a page's cheek. A coin slipped into a nurse's palm for a baby that wasn't his and was therefore entirely his. A deer turned from the hunt because he saw, just for an instant, the world from the deer's point of view and could not bear it. These are not policies. They do not show up in annals. But the people who lived them kept them like small warmths for nights when the frost crept under the door. You might be tempted to make the moral clean. Madness ruins nations. Weakness invites wolves. A crown demands a spine made of iron and prayer. But the trouble with clean morals is that they require you to simplify people into instruments. He was a fault, she was a sin, they were a lesson, and Charles resists it. He is not only a ruin, he is also a boy who loved dogs. A man who wrote his name in the margins of things when he was clear enough to remember that he liked to see his handwriting. A king whose jaw clenched when he had to raise taxes and who then ordered that the orphanage at Saint-Gervais receive money first before the collectors went to the silk merchants because he knew what winter does to children. He is also the sinkhole into which a country's faith in itself collapses. That is true too. You can love a man and also tally honestly the harm his body did to the people tied to his fate. The easiest villains in his story are the pamphleteers whose ink stank of hatchet work, and the nobleman who discovered that nothing was more convenient than a king who could be made to sign any paper placed beneath his hand. The hardest villains are the diseases that take a brain in the prime of its life and rewire it into a labyrinth, then change the walls while the person runs. If you need devils in this tale, those are the devils, invisible, indifferent, devourers of names. What does Paris look like at the end? The palaces still stand, the river still moves, the bridges are crowded as they always were, with vendors and laughter and a basket of fish that flips itself free, and a boy who will tell his children in 30 years that once, when he was small, the King of France sat down on the curb beside him and asked if the river ever spoke to him the way it spoke to the king. And the boy had said yes because he was a boy, and what else would he say to a man in a crown who looked at him with such desperate hope? The war does not end because Charles does. It breaks, reforms, continues. Jeanne d'Arc will come with her banners and her voice that sounds like something pulled straight from a bell, and the story will move on without him. The men who used his absences as rope to climb will keep climbing until they fall. The boy disinherited at Troyes will, after years of defeat and stubbornness, and the quiet obstinacy of people who do not accept their names being removed by ink, wear a crown that fits. The queen will survive her husband by a few years, long enough to watch her son's coronation at Reims, and feel all the complicated things a woman feels when the world she held together with the muscles of her jaw and the lie of her smile no longer needs her to do it. And yet, if you stand in the courtyard of the Hotel Saint-Paul at dawn, centuries later, when the air smells like wet lime and the first bread of the day, and you close your eyes, there is a moment when all the other kings fall away and you can hear him. Not the scream, not the sob, the laugh. Short, unsure, a human sound, the kind a man makes when, for no reason he can name, the weight shifts from one shoulder to the other, and he thinks, for the space of 3 heartbeats, that he is lighter than he was before. That's the thread you follow back through the maze, through the glass and the fire and the mud of Agincourt, and the hollowed rhetoric of men who mistook pamphlets for salvation and the stab of a knife on a dark Paris street. Back to a boy swinging into a saddle, too proud to admit that the heat hurts him, too young to know that some warnings you cannot outpace if they come from inside your own skull. The first scream didn't sound human. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a whole country opening its mouth in a palace at the end of a long summer and discovering that the sound it made when it was afraid could crack walls. Or maybe it was only a man, alone in a room crowded with people who loved him, realizing that the map in his head no longer matched the ground under his feet. Either way, the echo of it runs right under the cobbles, down into the river, out past the gates, through the fields where families still look up when the wind changes because the wind in France obeys no king. It is not a curse. It is not a lesson. It is a sound that says, this too happened. A crown was a cage. A man was glass and also iron, and also river mud and also laughter. He forgot his name, and still there were days he remembered yours. He held a country in hands that shook, and sometimes, for a little while, he didn't spill it. If you came looking for a monster, you will be disappointed, because monsters are tidy. If you came looking for a saint, you will also be disappointed, because saints are useful in ways people rarely are. What you will find is a story that refuses to stay where you put it, that wriggles out of your palm like a fish and leaves your skin smelling of something wild. You will find a king who was deranged and beloved, a reign that was catastrophe and cradle, a city that learned to live beside a broken mind, the way sailors learn to read a dangerous sea, watching the color of the waves, listening for the pitch of the wind, steering by instinct when the stars won't hold still. And as the servants in the corridor lower their heads and the guardsmen unclench their fists and the physician peels off the iron-boned garment and the queen takes 2 steps forward because if he looks up and knows her, she will be there, and if he looks up and does not, she will still be there. The scream goes quiet. The candles steady. Someone outside starts to laugh at a joke that will not be remembered. Paris goes on. The crown sits on its pillow like a question no one knows how to answer. And in this room, in this breath, there is only a man who once loved hunting and now cannot abide the sound of hooves, who once blessed a city from a balcony and now hides from windows because the light looks like knives, who once broke in a forest on a hot day in August and never quite came back. That is the story. Not a parable, a life, a king whose mind became a battlefield and dragged a nation onto it, who taught his people more than he ever knew about endurance, about the indignity and dignity of surviving what cannot be cured, about how love looks when it can do nothing and still refuses to leave. The first scream didn't sound human. The last breath did.